The United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, and after the world took a turn into darkness, the leader of the little free world that is left. The story how we got here is a complicated one, but simply put, with German hegemony in Europe and Japanese supremacy in Asia, there was nothing we could do to turn the losing Second World War back to an Allied victory. So once the atomic bomb killed 50,000 people in Pearl Harbor, we were forced to conditionally surrender. From that day on, the world map changed to become unrecognizable. German influence spread all the way to Africa and the Japanese into our very own ports. However, it wasn't the territorial changes who were the worst for our union. It was the political changes which spawned in what many commentators call the American malaise. A rise in poverty and stagnation with civil rights issues who have previously plunged our nation into riots. And the current president, Richard Nixon, leader of the coalition between the Republican and Democratic parties, has so far done little to fix the issues. This coalition was one formed in the late 50s to let the establishment preserve their power. And while it is shaky at times, through backroom deals and horse trading, it has been able to stay in power. However, they are not unchallenged, because an even stranger coalition between progressives and nationalists called the NPP. With them gaining popularity throughout the country, the party could very well challenge the RD coalition in the next election. But it is more than 2 years away, which leaves Nixon's presidency plenty of time to work on their goals. And one of their main focuses has been foreign affairs, where a policy of containment theory has been adopted. An all-out war against our enemies is not the goal, but by subtly infiltrating and sabotaging their spheres, we can weaken it and slowly but surely shrink it. And the first opportunity to smash the crested wave has been found in a Malayan revolt. While we can't send volunteers just yet, by instigating local revolts, we helped the revolutionary forces to capture a second port so we could send in the 5th Infantry Division and 4 squadrons of CAS aircrafts. Expecting Japanese anger, Nixon increased the budget of the FBI and CIA, which will play an important part in protecting us and help destroy the influence of our enemies. Once our forces arrived, we saw immediate victories. Our squadrons were helping the Malayan militias win battles against far better equipped Japanese garrisons, and the 5th Infantry Division was making substantial gains towards Singapore. Unfortunately, with Japanese garrisons, we were unable to enter the city. However, this gave us the idea to cut off a majority of their army in the north. It took a few battles, but by winning all of them, probably more than 5 Japanese divisions were now all encircled, and with the help of the Malayan forces, they were all killed or captured. So once we returned to Singapore, this time together with Malaya, the city quickly capitulated and victory was declared. Not only for Malaya, but also for Nixon, who will finally see some good press about himself, because in domestic policy he has not received much positivity. Protests around civil rights have flared up again, and Martin Luther King Jr. held a speech in front of 25,000 people, which led to the Democrat part of the coalition starting to demand that Nixon takes a side in the issue. Even John F. Kennedy, his vice president, is pushing for it. And all this is taking place right during election season, not presidential, but still 1/3 of all Senate seats. And so far the issues striking the RD coalition are showing in polling, as the NPP are predicted to win 14 more seats, with close races in important states like California and New York. Then even worse news arrived for Nixon, as the coalition truly was in disarray over the civil rights issue. He would try to continue ignoring it by opening up relations with India, but the chaos had grown too big and his vice president had, according to him, become damn too irritating, so he had to take a side. And the side he took was against the Democrats and his VP, because it is they who have made it into such a huge issue, weakened the coalition and his chances to win the 1964 election. So he let Kennedy try to pass his landmark bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1962, and by chance it had enough support among the Republican senators. But it wouldn't last, because once the bill passed the Senate, Nixon clamped down on it by issuing his presidential veto so that maybe the Democrats will settle down for 5 goddamn minutes. Many political pundits saw this as an impulsive act of rage by Nixon, and the effects of it was the creation of a rift in our politics. Riots began in the north as most urban voters moved towards the progressives in the NPP, while in the more rural areas Nixon gained popularity. Dixiecrat and hardline Republican support of the coalition was also strengthened, while the more responsible Republicans and Labour Democrats saw it as a great betrayal. But whatever this means for the future, at least with the whole ordeal over with, the White House can return to foreign policy. With currently no interventions on their way, we continued building up our relation with India, investing some funds into the country, but soon we were needed elsewhere. The CIA had, together with the Mexicans and Cubans, put up a plan to overthrow the fascist government in Dominica, which are actively threatening our Haitian ally. The plan is to initiate the landing in the north of the island with 6 brigades, most of which are Cuban legionary forces who come from all across the Caribbean with one goal: to fight fascism. Meanwhile, our job will be to supply them and aid them through naval, air and intelligence support. While waiting for it to prepare, the midterm elections took place, where NPP gains weren't as substantial as they had hoped, with only 12 new seats gained. This was mainly due to a last-minute successful campaign for the RD coalition in the East Coast, which made them win New York with only 0.3% of the vote. Continuing to wait, we drafted the South African Plan. The nation is one of the last true democratic strongholds in Africa, and its northern border is full with Germans. So we need to tie our countries together so that if something occurs, we can help them out and maybe reduce the grip of fascism in Africa in the process. It included things like expanding business ties and showing our commitment to their democracy. While continuing to wait, we got involved in 2 more conflicts. One in Madagascar, where we will support the local population against the Germans, but only through limited weapon shipments. And the other being in the Philippines, where due to a stock market crash in Japan, hostilities erupted. Being far more invested in this conflict, we plan to send volunteers in 30 days. We also increased weapon smuggling into the nearby country of Indonesia to continue the weakening of Japanese control now that they are so weak at home as well. However, the landing in Dominica had now finally taken place, so we had to divert our attention back to it. It started well, with the Cuban forces even destroying one of the fascist brigades. But with supplies starting to run out and with us being unable to increase it due to a lack of command power, our allies started to suffer heavy losses on the battlefield, and eventually they had been fully kicked out of the island. Not only does this mean that the Dominican people will stay oppressed, but it has also caused severe trouble for Nixon back home, who has seen a sharp drop in popularity due to the complete disaster of an invasion. But he didn't have time to cry, because the next intervention was already taking place in the Philippines. The Japanese-controlled forces had already destroyed the Northern Rebellion, which left our friends in the Free Philippine Republic to take on the full force of Japanese interventions alone. But not for long, because soon 2 of our elite, not-so-airborne divisions had arrived to the scene. But even though they are equipped with tanks, we could still use their helicopters to do island hopping, which would be our main objective in the beginning. Despite outnumbering us, the enemy forces weren't ready on such a powerful attack, which allowed us to capture the first island, liberate our first city, and even encircle a whole bunch of enemy forces. Using our momentum, we continued north until we reached the main island. Once again, we easily established the beachhead, and together with Philippine successes as well, we managed to reach Manila in a few days, prompting a Japanese retreat back to Tokyo. However, they did say they would be back, so just in case we invested into their army. And this return arrived quite quickly, so we immediately sent back our volunteers and air force. However, we are confident in victory, so we won't have to focus on it. Neither on an internal conflict that has arisen in Haiti, because something far more substantial had taken place. Hitler, the person who has inflicted so much harm on our world, died, and his country almost instantaneously plunged into civil war. And this means almost all Einheit Pact members will instantly implode into rebellion. And that was what happened, with uprisings in Poland, Ostland, and soon in Moscovian and Ukraine. But worryingly, their African colonies were not affected by this chaos. Instead, they formed the Africa Shield, an immoral colonial alliance. What followed was a Boer rebellion in South Africa, since they had been inspired by the German alliance, and soon this rebellion had escalated to a full-scale war with full German involvement. Nixon quickly called all members of the Organization of Free Nations to a meeting in New York where Security Resolution 13 was passed unanimously allowing OFN intervention in the war. We will save South African democracy and smash the invading Nazis. We are already preparing to send over 2 divisions and a total of 300 aircrafts. However, since this war is such a huge matter of national security, we will certainly escalate it. And for this, it is necessary to fight on the home front as well. Our experts do not believe in a quick victory, so if we don't make sure to keep public support of the war high, the intervention will fail miserably. Therefore, the media has been kick-started to raise support for SAF democracy and our intervention. Once our 2 preliminary volunteer forces arrived, the war had already escalated, with the Pan-African ANC having risen up against both the Republic and the Nazis. And thus it already became necessary to send more forces, but to succeed with this will be a lot of work. We need to quickly resolve the logistical nightmare that has formed at South African ports, especially since we are not only sending weapons but also humanitarian aid. By passing the Security Resolution 14 to create a united OFN High Command, we were able to help our allies deploy their own volunteers. But before they arrived, our own forces already saw some action as we helped the SAF army push out the Nazi forces from the small city of Kimberley. The South Africans also managed to liberate Bloemfontein. But despite this minor victory, we fear that once the ANC are defeated, which they quickly were, the enemy forces will be able to overwhelm us. So it is time to turn the tables of not only this war but all of recent history. No longer will fascism win, the time for democracy and freedom is going to arrive. And to achieve this, Nixon declared a national state of emergency so that we can rapidly execute orders unlike the Congress. He immediately declared a huge expansion of our operations, which allowed us to send 5 additional divisions to help turn the war to a victory. While waiting for them to arrive, we can discuss about some important things that have fallen into the background due to the war. In foreign affairs, victory was declared in the Philippines, and we had started assisting the highly potential ally to rebuild. Back home, the all-important campaign for the upcoming presidential election had been launched. So far it looks like Nixon will be able to win his re-election bid on a slim majority, but there is something that could come into his way. A Department of Justice investigation in accusations that Nixon has engaged in illegal wiretapping and spying on his rival party, the NPP. What this investigation will result in is unsure, but the fact that it is happening means that there is still a lot that can change regarding this election. But back to South Africa now, our extra volunteer forces had arrived and were ready to launch their first major offensive of the war, with the goal to outflank the enemy forces trying to capture Durban. And so we started. The Boer Rebellion has been defeated and most Nazi forces in the region absolutely demolished. However, this doesn't mean victory and there is still a long way to go. During these operations in South Africa, a second highly important foreign affairs matter had reached us from Europe. Because of the German Civil War, the rebel group of Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance in the UK had risen up against the German puppet regime and were able to liberate the country. However, now that Germany has reunited under Bormann, who seeks to reclaim all former Einheitspact land, a crisis has formed. We will do all we can to help the Free British raise readiness for an eventual German invasion. And if we are able to keep it higher than the Germans' readiness, they might no longer be willing to strike and instead enter negotiations. So we improved our links with the HMMLR, sent them aid and a bunch of other things to raise their readiness. Quickly returning to South Africa, we had moved our forces to the west to strike the Reichskommissariat Sydvästafrika. The attack started from the most northern South African territory to outflank the enemy forces in our west. This was a great idea since soon we had reached the sea, encircling 4 divisions in the city of Lüderitz-Oort. Shortly after this, Australian forces entered the capital of Sydvästafrika. Back to England, the crisis had now entered the confrontation stage, which means we need to know the German readiness as well in order to act accordingly. So we started gathering intelligence, which gave us a confirmation that our readiness is greater than theirs. Therefore, we won't act now and instead raise our political power that has fallen significantly due to all our actions. This was smart because we will soon need it since the Germans have managed to lower our readiness by a lot. But before we could raise it back, we had to quickly return home as the investigation into Nixon's alleged wiretapping had escalated significantly. The FBI had soon arrested some of his staffers who were now proven to have participated. This caused one NPP senator to put forward an impeachment process on Nixon. While the NPP might not have a majority, a lot of Democrats were planning to vote for this process, which made it highly likely for it to go through. So with impeachment inevitable, Nixon decided to leave on his own record and resign, leaving his vice president John F. Kennedy as new president. This would normally change a lot of things, since a Kennedy presidency means a pro-civil rights presidency. But now that the elections are only a few months away and Nixon has destroyed most of the trust in the government, Kennedy merely is here to extinguish the flames in the RD coalition and restore the American people's trust in our government. So the real consequences of Nixon's resignation was its effect on the election, because the NPP saw a huge increase in popularity, especially among urban voters. What's reassuring, however, is the fact that Kennedy has the same foreign policy as Nixon and that he is ready to end the Channel crisis. But before that, he would order a new major offensive in South Africa to show his commitment to this important war as well. With the German forces having already been defeated beyond the point of coming back, we are now looking to fully root them out of Africa. Our allied forces had already liberated parts of Mozambique, and our new offensive would be to reach Angola. Since as said the enemy was already severely weakened, we met no resistance that could stop us. The biggest issue was in fact our own supply and speed. So naturally the offensive was soon declared a success and we could turn back our focus to the Channel crisis. We started by determining the German readiness, which came up as higher than ours. Therefore we significantly bumped up ours by focusing on the defense, but not before trying to slightly reduce German readiness. Once we were certain we were at least slightly more prepared than them, we requested to open negotiations. We are of course aware that we will have to agree on a lot of their demands, but the important thing is that we get them to accept that Britain is not a part of the Einheitspact. After 20 days of tough negotiations, we had succeeded. The Germans had agreed to leaving the UK alone, but at the cost of us including other promises, agreeing not to place nukes in their country and forcing the English to demilitarize the southeastern coast. And so our duty in England has been achieved, and with the reconstruction of the Philippines, this only leaves the conflict in South Africa, which also is on its way to be won. So this calmness that has formed outside our border leaves us to focus on the internal issues. JFK had started to progress on healing the RD coalition, and to raise popular support he also started meeting with the people of America with a huge tour around the country. But while hope was building in the urban areas, many rural and anti-civil rights citizens were worried that if he won the coming election, he would pass his Civil Rights Act and steer the country towards communism. It would only take one man to set up a plan, and once Kennedy arrived to his town, he would never leave it, having been shot and killed. This sent shockwaves throughout our country. Never before has the Speaker of the House been forced to take command. And what people previously called the American malaise has turned into a despair. Now, John McCormack, the Speaker of the House who has been forced to rapidly take the seat of President, is not here to pass any legislation. The elections are too close for this. Instead, he will try to continue Kennedy's work to heal the nation. What he actually did was inconsequential, because the full focus of the nation was now on the upcoming election. The NPP had previously had a hard time to find a candidate that is popular and well known enough to ride them to victory, because their previous candidate, Henry M. Jackson, Jackson had suffered a huge electoral loss in 1960 for not being this. But after the unfortunate death of John F. Kennedy, the progressives had found a perfect candidate, his brother Robert Kennedy. Holding a powerful speech criticizing the party of his family and rallying support for the civil rights issues, he was able to win the NPP primaries against the segregationist governor George Wallace. In polling, he already saw huge successes as 10 new progressive NPP senators were polled to win, which would grant the NPP a majority in the Senate and make the progressives the biggest group. As a response to this, the people in the RD coalition elected the Republican Wallace Bennett in the hopes to split the NPP vote between progressives and nationalists. Looking outside of the US for a short while, the HMMLR leadership had announced the first free elections in the UK for a long while, and the winner, the Conservative Party, immediately put forward legislation to join the OFN, propelling our sphere of influence to encompass almost 33% of global GDP. In South Africa, the war had also advanced as a new offensive captured the rest of the Angola coast, leading to the capitulation of the first of 3 Reichskommissariats. With the 2 left also only having about 7 to 16 divisions left, it is safe to assume that the next president will be able to launch the final orders to destroy Nazism in Africa. But back to the election, the time to vote has finally arrived. As the smaller states announced their candidate first, the race started tight as it seemed like the RD gamble to split the NPP vote had paid off, winning them most of the South. However, they didn't expect the amount of Democrat voters turning towards RFK, and after California gave him their 32 electors, Bennett had a hard time to catch up. Then, as the northern states of New York and Pennsylvania, together with Texas, all voted a majority for Kennedy, he was able to secure a majority in the lower house and win the election with 358 electoral votes. In addition to this being the first time an NPP president will take office, the NPP is also controlling the Senate for the first time. However, the biggest group is not the progressives, it's the nationalists and the Democrats. 2 months later, the inauguration is finally here and the work of a second, though highly different, Kennedy presidency can begin. We will champion the cause of civil rights, address the issue of poverty and inequality, and continue to spread freedom throughout the world by taking a more aggressive stance against Japanese occupation, the main thing uniting the NPP. As the time of celebration and victory speeches came to an end, Kennedy started working, beginning by appointing his ministers, such as the first woman becoming the Secretary of the Treasury and a war hero as defense minister who almost immediately gave the orders to end the Germans in Africa. The South Africans and other volunteer forces had already destroyed the East African Reichskommissariats, which left only Central Africa left. And soon as the orders arrived, our forces started driving north, and with little resistance, the capital Leopoldville and its neighboring city of Brazzaville were both captured. But despite this, some enemy forces were still resisting, and we had to chase them down along their artificial lake in central Congo until they had all fled into German ships or were defeated. And thus victory was declared in Africa. The Nazis have been pushed away from a whole continent in a triumph greater than any of ours yet. But now comes the difficult thing of managing these lands. Thankfully, the South African Republic, now a full member of the OFN, will integrate Namibia, Botswana, South Rhodesia and southern Mozambique. In the rest of the territories, we have established OFN mandate states under the leadership of our military, whose goal it is to denazify, stabilize and eventually decolonize these territories. Fortunately, they will be able to do most of the work, which means we can return back home and check out what Kennedy has been doing. After appointing his ministers, it was time to decide the direction of his presidency and determine who to ally, the nationalists in his party or the Democrats across the aisle. After careful thought, he decided to keep the pact above all. This will of course be difficult as policy and platforms are severely different, but if handled well, the NPP could grow stronger and we would be able to take a more aggressive stance on foreign policy issues. It was of course unpopular among his core supporters that he would cooperate with the most nationalists of all, including for example George Wallace. However, there was one issue in which this couldn't be accepted: the issue of civil rights. Instead, Kennedy reached out to the Democrats to rally their progressives to get their help in passing his first major bill, which will be a new civil rights bill, to make America free of malice and in memory of his brother who fought for the same exact thing. While preparing to put the foot in the door and begin negotiations with the Democrats, another war on foreign soil had started. You might remember how we supported Indonesian resistance against the Japanese. Well, as the NPP assumed office, this support picked up speed and the Sukarno dictatorship would soon face a full-blown civil war. We sent over one division for now and several aircrafts to help out the Free Indonesian uprising. And so another proxy war now in the Indonesian jungles has begun. After half a year of warfare, we have won most battle, but it almost feels like we are losing the war. Because once Japanese volunteers arrived, the enemy forces could advance everywhere where we weren't, allowing them to regain a foothold on Sumatra. Therefore, despite knowing it would cause discontent at home, RFK prepared to send over 3 more volunteers, quadrupling our commitment. But before they arrived, we will go back home and look at what has happened with the negotiations. The Democrats were glad to cooperate, but to get their goodwill, Kennedy started by cooperating together with them on some significant but more minor bills. A War Powers Act was passed, and the Environmental Protection Act was also passed safely through Congress, as we managed to somehow balance it between the Democrats and the Nationalists. With the bipartisanship now secured, we could move forwards with the important Civil Rights Bill. In order to avoid filibusters and not anger the Nationalists too much, RFK decided to skip a plan from the Democrats to jump over the Republican-leaning Judiciary Committee. This unfortunately weakened the bill, but at least it was sent to the floor without a filibuster to finally begin voting. After a long wait, the results finally arrived. The bill, which we had been working on for months, even years, got the majority in the Senate. The Civil Rights Act has been passed. We finally have true equal rights in our nation, just like the founding fathers wrote but never implemented. However, while this is a great improvement in the issue of civil rights, we are not ignorant. Many activists see this as only a token legislation, as there still needs to be done a significant amount of work regarding most notably the prison system, schooling and legal system. However, this will unfortunately have to wait, because if we would continue, the patience of the Nationalists would run out, and with the Senate election coming up, RFK has decided to begin focus on his second promise, that of poverty relief. We had already increased social funding, but now we accompanied it with a tax cut on the poorest, which will slowly begin to improve the situation. But to achieve the success we are after, we need to learn about the situation that people are in. Therefore, Robert Kennedy has set out on a tour across the nation to visit its vast communities and learn about their problems. While this tour went on, we returned our focus to Indonesia. Our 3 additional volunteer forces had safely arrived, but to the bad news that the PRIM military council had been defeated and Jakarta lost. Fortunately, we are here now to fix up this mess. We started by, just like in the start of the war, securing the west of Sumatra, which was simple since our forces were experienced from the South African War, and together with transport planes in the sky, we never ran out of supply. In the meantime, the Free Indonesian forces had surprisingly liberated Jakarta and made advances into the east of Sumatra. Using this momentum, we were able to clear Java of the last pockets of resistance, defeating a whole Japanese tank division. This allowed us to focus our full power on Sumatra and the possibility of then crossing to the strongest government stronghold, Borneo. Using all our 4 divisions, we advanced from the east and west simultaneously, achieving a huge encirclement as Palembang was liberated. Once the encircled forces were destroyed, we turned to the west, where we defeated the last forces on Sumatra and started the island hopping. The island in between was easily captured, but to land on Borneo was far harder. Still, we eventually secured a beachhead for our 4 divisions. We immediately sent some north to the headquarters of the dictatorship and some to the east. Now, due to the horrible supply, our progress was slow, but as soon as any enemy forces were met, they were quickly sent running away, which allowed us to reach Pontianak with no issues. Hours before reaching it, Sukarno fled into exile to Japan as the Free Government of Indonesia declared his forces defeated. And thus, another dominion of the Japanese sphere has fallen as victory in Indonesia has been declared. While the Free Indonesian government haven't joined the OFN, together with the Philippines and Malaysia, they make up an important part of our economic sphere nonetheless. So, with no more proxy wars at the moment, we can return back home where Kennedy has had his grand tour of the nation. He even went to the south to convince them of the importance of civil rights. But the main objective, one that was achieved, was to get testimony from the people in their poverty worries, and thus started the government's fight or even war against poverty. By ignoring some nationalist demands, a wave of strong legislations could be introduced, like the creation of food banks to buy excess food and give it to those in need. A job corps inspired by the New Deal was also introduced to help employ the youth. We then started working on the Affordable Housing Act, which we will have to try to pass through Congress. Fortunately, with our 26 senators, 21 of the Democrats, a few Republicans and the Nationalists who we discussed the plan with to raise their support, we have a majority. And so the act was easily passed through Congress, making the housing situation in our country far better. Together with the other acts and great economic growth, we are also starting to see important effects on the poverty rate. This was important because the Senate elections had now arrived. In it, the people of America gave RFK their approval as our progressive caucus gained 2 seats. However, with the nationalists losing 4 to the Republicans, the NPP total has gone down with 2, leaving us with only a slight majority left. To try to gain back some of the nationalists' trust after their defeat, in his next speech, RFK would make sure to be seen shaking hands with the nationalist supporter, who had now started to see him as a danger to the right. But after this, we would continue with the war against poverty. To keep the war going, even after we no longer implement new acts, we need to build up a safety net for our population. We did this mostly by raising subsidies for the poorest. We also expanded the food banks to further reduce the amount of hungry mouths in our nation. But this was the last anti-poverty act for now, and with no foreign interventions at the moment, this left us with a great opportunity to prepare for the one thing that unites the NPP. Our goal to retake the American lands lost to Japan. This means preparing our army for a full-scale war, something which can be unpopular among our population. So we decided to take the safe and more popular option by mostly focusing on the industrial side of preparations. And so we began militarizing our industry. Through some negotiations with private companies, we could turn some of their factories into war material ones. We would also focus on raising production efficiency on the factories that already exists. But while we started focusing on the treaty ports themselves, by starting to spy on them, an important war started that we have to intervene in. A war between the West African Alliance, led by the Free French Forces, and the Pan-African Liberation Front, led by the Cameroonian African State. Since the French alliance is mostly democratic, and with the Pan-Africanists having caused trouble against our OFN mandate in Congo, it is clear that we will support the French. We started by simply sending over military advisors and infantry weapons to them. As a consequence, the war started well for our friends, as they managed to capitulate the first Pan-African nation and secure the West at the same time. So, with the possibility of a quick war, we aided the French even more, helping them to expand their foreign legion and sending them 60 aircrafts to gain air superiority. Leaving the French to use these new toys, we returned home where RFK had introduced the Women's Occupational Military Equality Normalization Act, which will open up support roles for women in the army. Maybe the only equality issue that can fully unite our party. and so the act was easily passed through Congress despite its stupidly long name. We would then increase funding of R&D to keep our army as the most modern fighting force in the world. While we currently focus most of these resources on our armored vehicles, we will soon switch it to our aircrafts, possibly our greatest advantage against the Japanese. At this time, we also started investing into our OFN allies, mostly into our northern brothers and the land down under, since a united OFN will be scarier for the Japanese. Returning to the war in West Africa, Niger had been captured. However, with insurgencies in French land, the war started to slow down. Therefore, we escalated our support by deploying our navy to harass convoys with war material heading towards our enemies, and sent another round of infantry equipment. On the ground, the Ghanese socialists had tried to reach their Cameroonian ally, but with us strengthening the French, they instead became encircled as Lagos was liberated. And with the loss of their most elite forces, Ghana would soon fall, leaving only Cameroon left. Other great news arrived also from Africa, but from our OFN mandates. The Eastern Mandate, which had started as the most unstable one, had now been able to stabilize the lands and safely decolonize into 6 new countries, all democratic and in our economic sphere. Similarly, Angola also received their independence, but they decided to stay in the OFN. The Mandate in Congo are however still working on their decolonization efforts. Back to Cameroon, with the Free French forces about to win at any moment, we can return back home because the election campaign for the 68th presidential election has started. And this election could be one of the strangest yet, because RFK and his progressives are by far the most popular, and currently he is projected to win the presidential election. However, due to the collapse of the nationalists, the RD coalition are projected to sweep the Senate. Whatever happens, there will be an interesting campaign where both parties will try to take over the area where the other is strong. Trying to ignore the election for now, RFK would continue building up against the Japanese. So far it had gone extremely well, as according to our spies we are severely outproducing the Japanese, so we could say that we are ready for battle. However, Kennedy only plans to act after a successful election, as demanding back the treaty ports right now poses a big risk for his campaign. So instead we will continue building up mainly around the ports to improve our spying on them. While further uniting the OFN, the news of a French victory in Cameroon arrived. The peace deal was quick as new democracies were established in the West, while due to the cost of occupation Cameroon was left as it is. However, our duty is not over. We need to help the French and their allies to reconstruct their industry along with their military to ensure the Cameroonians can't get their revenge. Therefore, we continued sending them weapons and military assistance, but also started economic assistance. We would both send simple humanitarian aid, but also help them rebuild infrastructure such as ports and railways. At the same time, we received news that the Mandate in Congo had finally been able to decolonize into 3 nations, all part of our economic sphere. And thus our work in Southern Africa can finally be declared over. Back to Western Africa, the aid had gotten its effect, but we need to send far more. So we decided to recruit the help of some of our companies, like Firestone and Hershey's, while also escalating the rest of our support. Returning back to the US, while RFK will be the candidate for the NPP, the RD coalition have to have a primary to choose between the Republican Barry Goldwater and the Democrat Philip Hart. The race began extremely tight, but with the public opinion having shifted towards the left due to RFK, the Democrat Philip Hart won the primary. And this makes the election even more interesting. Polling between the two is close, with Hart even winning in some polls. This can be explained due to the fact that many northern voters see RFK as a conservative, while the southerners see him as far too progressive. So to try and regain some initiatives, Kennedy decided to return to what he knew best, passing anti-poverty legislation. It started with introducing volunteer work or community action, and then he went on to try to pass the Federal Student Aid Act. By garnering support from the nationalists, it passed through Congress with only 2 votes. Not only did this act raise support for RFK, but it will also greatly help our students. However, once he tried passing his next act, the Economic Opportunity Act, a lot less opposition senators supported the bill, forcing him to open talks with the Democrats. Unfortunately for Kennedy, they slowed down the negotiations to a point that before it was over, the elections had arrived. After a jarring election night, the results were announced. Philip Hart had won with 333 electoral votes due to what many believe was a protest vote against RFK. Because even though Hart is on the left of the RD coalition, he won by a landslide in the South. And he also saw huge gains in the previously RFK voting states. Michigan was the epitome of this as he won by 22%. He was even close to turn California around. Some days later, the Senate election results were also announced, a second blow for the NPP as the Nationalists were reduced to 11 seats and the RD coalition gained a majority of 10 seats, the same as in 1962. Preparing to hand over power, Kennedy signed his last law, the Economic Opportunity Act, that the Democrats in the end accepted. And hopefully this will, despite his electoral defeat, grant him a legacy of the first president to seriously pick up the fight against poverty, as this law both raised unemployment subsidies and pensions. He also had the time to declare reconstruction of West Africa complete, granting him the legacy of the president who ended all our campaigns in Africa with victories. But Kennedy's time is now over, as he gave over the White House to Hart, knowing that it would be in good hands. And so I thank you for watching this extra long 100,000 subscribers special. But the story of America isn't over yet, and the next video will focus on the Hart presidency. And also, thanks so much for 100,000 subscribers. Creating my channel over 3 years ago, I could only dream of this number. So again, thanks so much for watching and I see you in the next video.